everyone, I'm Cheryl Mahoney and I blog at marveloustales.com or Tales of the Marvelous about books and writing. And I am working my way through the Anne of Green Gables 8-book series by L.M. Montgomery, who is my favorite author. I've read all of her books, 200 of her short stories, give or take? No, I think it is exactly 200, I counted, and her complete published journals. So I have a lot of thoughts about her books when I read them, and I am working through, probably for the 4th or 5th time, of the Anne of Green Gables series. Today I'm going to talk about Anne of Avonlea, and this is book 2, after the more famous Anne of Green Gables. I have a feeling a lot of people don't know that any of the ones after book 1 exist. So thank you for watching. I assume you're interested in knowing more details about L.M. Montgomery and her books if you've decided to watch a review of book 2, sequel to her most famous book that everyone knows. So in book 2, you can tell from the cover, Anne is no longer the pigtailed, reckless girl of book 1. She is now quite a mature young lady, which is interesting. I said in my last review, I think it's a little bit of a shame how quickly Anne grew up. I think Montgomery might have handled that differently if she had realized from the beginning she was going to write a series. Because in this book, Anne is really quite the mature young lady. She's actually teaching school in Avonlea and succeeding very well. Everyone thinks she's quite wonderful. Her pupils love her. And in a way, I'm sorry, because she was a more entertaining character when she got into trouble more. She's a little bit perfect by this point. Not completely. L.M. Montgomery explores some of her flaws and she makes some mistakes, but she doesn't have the same degree of comical mishaps that she had in book 1. And it feels like a lot of her kind of self-growth has already happened. I mean, she continues growing, and that continues to be something Montgomery explores, but not to the same degree that we saw in book 1. So it's still a good book. It's charming, but it is different than book 1. I think Montgomery felt a little bit trapped. She says in her journals she had to write book 2. I mean, I guess she didn't have to, but her publishers insisted that she should write book 2 because book 1 was an unbelievable, unexpected success. And they're like, okay, now we want book 2 from you. And she had not planned to write it. She said she herself, she didn't like it as well as book 1. She may have been hard on herself too. I mean, and I don't mean to be unreasonably hard on the book. It's a good book. It's charming. I enjoy it. It's not the first book, though, and I don't think it's actually one of the stronger ones in the 8-book series. Some of the later ones, I think, are better, actually. Book 5, I particularly like. I think even book 3 is a bit better than book 2. This is a little bit of an in-between book where we're still in Avonlea. We don't have new landscapes, but we also don't have comical Anne. Montgomery also said in her journals that she found it more difficult to write about young ladies, which is funny because she wrote about them a lot. But she said she could treat children and old people comically. You have to approach young women with a certain degree of reverence. And I don't know that that was entirely her own view, but it was what she felt the public demanded when she's writing a story. She also said she knew in book 3 she'd have to finally resolve Anne's romance. And you do get the sense she sort of felt she had to do that. And it's interesting how she handles that, but that's a discussion for book 3. Right now we're talking about book 2. There is very little romance in book 2. Montgomery also said she wasn't that comfortable writing sentiment, which again, she writes it a lot and she does it really well when she does it often, but for some reason she didn't feel that was her strength. I don't know. And you can kind of tell because even though Gilbert, Anne's love interest, is in this, he's not in it much. Like, there's little bits of him here and there, but not a lot for being the romantic hero. But I wouldn't call it a romance. Romance is not the focus of this, and really Anne and Gilbert are just good chums in this book. There's maybe some hints of a little bit more, especially at the very end, like the last chapter or so. Not a lot otherwise. The more focused romance is not Anne at all. It's Miss Lavender. It's a lovely story, actually. And her old beau who went away 20 years ago, and Miss Lavender is now an old maid, but such a charming old maid. And eventually, of course, Prince Charming, as Anne would put it, comes back to the enchanted garden and finds Miss Lavender. And that's quite lovely. Montgomery wrote a lot of romances for older couples. She wrote a lot of short stories, and you see it pop up in some of her other books where it's an older couple. And sometimes they're comical, like she said, she can write them more comically. Often she actually writes quite lovely romances for older couples, which was even more unusual at the time than it is now, I think, and it's still not usually what you see. All the stories are about 20-something or possibly 16 if you're in, fantasy and fairy tale land. So that was something Montgomery did very well. And that is more the romance of this book rather than Anne's, I would say. Montgomery introduces a few new characters because she's trying, I think, to make up for the lack of Anne being more comical. So there's Anne and Marilla, between them, adopt twins, Davy and Dora. Davy gets into all kinds of scrapes. I'm not sure why he's not quite as charming and memorable as Anne. I feel like I always forget about the twins when I think about this series. I don't know. Davy does provide some comic relief, though, and he is entertaining. I think some of it might be that I always feel sorry for Dora because she's this perfect, prim, model child, and the assumption seems to be that she has no depth to her. She just follows everything very carefully and never is as likable or charming or lovable as Davy, who gets into trouble, and Anne and Marilla kind of like Davy better, even though they sort of feel bad about that. And I feel bad for Dora, and I wonder what hidden depths she might have. And I don't think Montgomery intended her to have hidden depths, but I always wonder about it, and I think that would be an interesting story to explore. As far as I know, no one has, but it would have been interesting. Montgomery also introduces Mr. Harrison, who is the cranky neighbor down the road who then gets won over by Anne and ends up becoming a good friend of hers. He has a romance as well, and again, it's an older romance, and that seems to be where Montgomery is actually more comfortable telling the story. She got married herself later in life, so that may be a factor in how she handles those romances. So let's see, what else happens in here? They accidentally paint a hall blue. There's some comical elements there. Anne is a co-founder of a improvement society in the village, but they have some problems trying to get the town hall painted the color they intended. So there are some comical incidents. There's some incidents in the school. Paul Irving is a nice character, one of Anne's students, and he's whimsical and magical and talks all sorts of fancy with Anne, and there's quite a lot of poetry in there. I don't know that there's ever been a little boy actually like Paul Irving, but he's charming and we enjoy him. Davy might be the more realistic of the two, but who knows? It doesn't mean little boys can't have flights of fancy and poetry, and the implication is he'll probably grow up to be a poet, so it fits. I feel like there was something else I was going to talk about, but I don't know. It's a pretty good book. It's a good book. I don't think it's one of the stronger ones in the 8-book series. But I mean, if you're reading it through, don't skip it. It's a perfectly good book. There's lots of charming landscapes. There's good characters. There are comical incidents, as there always are with Montgomery. It's fun just to visit her world. If you get to book 2 and are like, it's not as good as book 1, keep reading to book 3. Book 3, I think, is better. Book 4 is pretty good. Book 5 I quite like. And I'll just hold off before I just, run through the whole list, because they'll each get their due when I get to a review of them. So for now, this was Anne of Avonlea. That is Anne of Green Gables, even though that's not how you'd probably picture her, all grown up now. It's a good book. It's not the best in the series, but I enjoy it anyway. I'm Cheryl Mahoney. I blog at marvelous tales.com, and thanks so much for watching.